This is Stephen Hilder's last skydive. The straps on his parachute have been cut. He's falling 13,000 feet to his death.
Everybody was in the frame to begin with.
The forensic evidence is entirely consistent with suicide.
He did not take his own life.
He's dead, and somebody did it.
It was the end of a week-long skydiving competition. But for Stephen Hilder, the day's skydive will end in tragedy and spark a police investigation unique in British crime history.
The weather hadn't been brilliant through the week. We'd done a few lifts on the Wednesday, I think 2-3 lifts on the Wednesday, that was about it. And the Friday had started off exactly the same as the rest of the week.
Then early afternoon, it was apparent that we'd be able to get one jump in, so we started to prepare for that.
This is footage filmed on the day of the competition. The three-man team are all officer cadets in the army and experienced skydivers who've each made over 200 jumps. Adrian Blair and David Mason are both 19, and Stephen Hilder is 20.
On the minibus, we were just laughing and joking around with one other team that was going to be jumping before us.
Skydiving instructor Paul Hollow was in charge on the day.
I have a list on the ground, so I know who went in the plane, and I know who I expect to come out the plane.
At 13,000 feet, the competition starts when Paul gives the go-ahead.
On the ride to altitude, we were just focusing on what we were going to be doing on the jump, going over things in our head. Before getting out, we just gave each other sort of a handshake, a high five, sort of a good luck sign.
Charlie, Oscar DZ, clear running, clear drop. Clear drop,
I had given the aircraft clear drop, so a couple of minutes after that, the aircraft dispatched the parachutists.
We climbed out of the plane and exited as a group. We started turning the different formations really fast. It was probably one of the best jumps we'd done together. We all had eye contact and had a big smile for each other, and because we knew we'd done really well on the jump. And at about 4,000 feet, we broke off. We got some horizontal separation so we could activate our own parachutes and clear airspace.
At this point, the cameraman loses sight of his fellow skydivers in the clouds.
And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw some white material, which made me think that something was wrong. It was just sensory overload at the time. I didn't really register what was happening.
On the ground, Paul was also puzzled. He could only see two of the team's parachutes, which are easy to spot because of their bright colors. He thought the last skydiver must have had a problem and used his white reserve parachute, which is harder to make out against the clouds.
I dispatched one of my instructors and a volunteer to go and pick up what I thought was a parachutist who'd had a malfunction and was then landing underneath the reserve. I radioed out to them and said, has anybody seen the final canopy? Nobody had seen it, and yet everybody else had landed exactly where they were supposed to land.
They asked me if I knew who it was, and I was able to tell them it was Steve because I recognised the distinctive colours of Dave's parachute. and also Tim, our camera guy. So I knew that they were both okay, and that it had to be Steve.
One of the guys radioed in saying, I found it. So I said, you found what? He said, I found the reserve parachute.
If the reserve parachute wasn't attached to a skydiver, then something had gone terribly wrong. They now knew they were searching for a body.
We basically stood on the car, and the crops at the time were quite long. It was just before harvest time. So we saw an indentation in the crops. Myself and the other instructor, Tony, went to investigate. Seeing a body laying there, particularly under those circumstances, is not what I would wish on anybody.
I was in shock, but when you skydive, you realise that it is such a high-risk activity sometimes that you do always prepare yourself for that the worst could happen.
But this was no accident.
I could not believe what I was seeing at the time. I hesitate to use the word sabotage, but there had been some kind of damage inflicted on that parachute before it had been used.
Paul noticed that the straps on the parachute had been cut. He called the police.
When I first got on the scene, I was told straight away that the parachute had been deliberately cut, so the potential for murder was there immediately.
Officers had never come across a case like this before. They took the unusual step of asking a skydiving expert to help collect evidence.
The police asked my colleague and I to put some white coveralls on and a mask and obviously some gloves. We then, under their instructions, took samples from parts of the equipment. Approximately 1.5 inches of the webbing is what the police required as a sample.
Officers started to search for other clues.
We searched the bins, the roofs and other parts of the site looking for knives or other sharp implements which could have caused the damage to Stephen's parachute. We inspected every piece of kit on site to make sure that nobody else has been tampered with, and unfortunately it hadn't been. The murderer could still have been at the scene if indeed this was a murder. So it was very important to get DNA from everybody at that scene and from anybody who'd been in contact with that parachute so we could compare the two.
The police took DNA samples from everybody, myself included. So yeah, I guess everybody was in the frame to begin with.
Two of the most important witnesses that we had to see were his diving colleagues, David Mason and Adrian Blair. They'd seen him during the day, they'd seen his equipment, they'd been on the flight. Potentially, they could tell us an awful lot.
Towards the end of the first interview I did on the day, I found out that the straps from Steve's parachute had been cut and that they were either looking at a suicide, but more probably a murder investigation.
"20-year-old Stephen Hilder fell to his death skydiving in the summer of 2003.
Got a knock on the door during the evening on the 4th of July, and there were 2 policemen on the doorstep, and you can tell that something's wrong.
Unless you've lost a child, I don't think anyone can understand what that feels like. And to not know why it happened or exactly what happened, to be in this situation where there's no sense to it either, if there ever is any sense in losing a child, you can't describe it, but it changes your life and changes it forever.
Stephen's death was the result of an act of sabotage. The straps on his parachute had been cut.
I don't really remember what went through my mind at the time. You're just in such a state of shock. But certainly right from the beginning, it made no sense that someone would want to do this to Steve.
And within hours of his death, the entire country was aware of it.
A skydiver who fell 13,000 feet to his death in Lincolnshire yesterday has been named as Stephen Paul Hilder.
This was the 20-year-old's final jump.
His parachute had been sabotaged, its cords were deliberately cut.
Police strongly suspect he was murdered.
The media interest in what happened to Steve is obviously something we'd never experienced before, and it's very difficult when you open a newspaper or turn the television on the radio and completely out of the blue your son's being talked about.
Every single channel was just showing a picture of Steve saying skydiver murdered. And I couldn't think of any motive why anybody would want to take his life. All that could go through my mind at that time was somebody was either targeting a skydiver, any skydiver, or they were after an individual but got the wrong man.
Stephen's girlfriend, Ruth Woodhouse, had been told about his death while on holiday. It was only later that she heard the murder theory.
I was on the way home and started getting signal on my mobile, and it started beeping and beeping and beeping, and I got all these messages like from loads of people, and then we got to a service station and it was on all the papers in the service station. There was my face on the papers, and my face had actually been in the papers before I knew about it.
Detectives hoped the media coverage would throw up a new lead from the public. At the same time, they were getting briefed on the mechanics of a parachute. Skydiving instructor Paul Hollow was their guide.
Now, on a normal skydive, when we want to use our main parachute, we grab this little handle and we pull out a little mini parachute that's inside here. So this is what we call a pilot chute. This then catches the air and acts as our anchor in the sky. As we fall away from this anchor, the bridle line, this piece of black tape, pulls out all the way up to this main pin here. The bridle can then pull the pin, which opens the flaps of the container, and then the rest of it pulls out the parachute for us. Just in case things don't quite go according to plan with the main parachute, we can grab the handle on the other side of the pack here, which we use to deploy the reserve parachute. This has a cable going up from the top here. It goes over the top of the parachute. It comes straight down to another pin. So as soon as this pin is moved, the flaps can open, and this white bit that you see here is the top of a big spring that jumps out and acts in exactly the same way as our main pilot chute. It grabs the air and acts as our anchor in the sky and pulls out the reserve for us.
Here, a skydiver releases a faulty main parachute and opens the reserve. But both Stephen's main and reserve chutes had been sabotaged.
Here then, we have the main pilot chute. This had been pulled out, and what must have happened is they pulled it out and they then cut the bridle. They'll just fold it back up and put it back inside the container. So now, when you go to throw the pilot chute away, that's exactly all you're doing. You're throwing that away, but because the bridle had been cut, it can no longer pull the pin. If the pin can't be pulled, the flaps stay closed, and you can never, ever have the main parachute come out. And he tried to use the reserve, and he pulled his reserve handle. The reserve parachute did deploy. He pulled the reserve canopy out of the container and started it deploying, but unfortunately the reserve was no longer attached to him. Here are the risers of the main parachute, okay? Underneath those we then have the bits of strapping that go to the lines of the reserve canopy itself, and these had been cut. So it was as if somebody had put scissors or a knife or whatever had been used to cut the risers about there and had then closed the flap over the top of them.
There was also a backup device which would automatically release Stephen's parachute if he didn't open it. He'd activated this device before the jump, but because the straps to his parachutes had been cut, it was to prove useless. Stephen had done everything to save himself. and his behaviour in the week leading up to his death made suicide seem unlikely.
I last spoke to him on the Friday, just a week before it happened. Talked to him at length on the phone, and he was absolutely normal and enthusiastic, talking particularly about going to the Bon Jovi concert the following day with you.
Yeah, which is when last time I saw him. He was taking me to a Bon Jovi concert in Hyde Park on Saturday as an early birthday present. Spent the whole day with him, and he was absolutely his normal self.
Stephen spent the Sunday before his death skydiving at Netheravon Airfield, near the Army College where he and Ruth were studying.
On the Monday, we went to Alton Towers for the day. It was a treat that I gave him to go to Alton Towers, and we had a really, really good day. I think we were probably the last people to leave the park because we were just having great fun. The last time I actually saw Steve, we drove out of the main gate and he turned right to go north to Lincoln and I turned left to go back down to Swindon.
Stephen drove 100 miles to Hibblestow Airfield in North Lincolnshire for the skydiving competition. Those closest to him said he was acting normally and seemed happy, not behaving like someone contemplating suicide. This supported the police theory that he'd been murdered. But who would want to kill him?
What we needed to do was have a minute-by-minute look at where he was or what he was doing, in the hope that that would give us the answer as to why Stephen died. Was he involved in criminality? Had he offended somebody? Or was he the victim of some lone lunatic? Did he have a secret life? Did he have a secret lover? We were looking at all possibilities.
Detectives retraced the days before Stephen's death and found that he'd driven 11 miles to a petrol station, Kirk's Corner, on the previous Tuesday. Why he'd gone there was a mystery. There were other garages far closer to the airfield.
To find the place, you would really either come across it by accident or have to go and look for it. And we wondered why Stephen was there. What was he doing? Was he meeting somebody? Was it a friend, associate, a skydiver? We do know that he bought some provisions at the store there. And when we recovered Stephen's car, it had virtually no petrol in it at all. So again, we wondered why, had he gone to a garage, why didn't he fill his car with petrol?
The following day, Stephen made his first skydive of the week. Police knew that his parachute must have been sabotaged sometime after that jump.
He might have packed his rig on the Wednesday. He might have got somebody else to pack it for him. There are plenty of packers in the sport who make their living packing other people's parachutes.
Stephen's kit was believed to have been left in the kit room, and there has been a great deal of debate about how secure that place was. My understanding is it wasn't very secure.
We make the kit store available to everyone. It's locked and alarmed at the end of the day, but nobody ever expects somebody to come along and cause any damage to your parachute. Skydivers trust each other. We have to.
There were over 70 competitors from all over the country, and all had access to the kit room. Stephen's team was called Black Rain.
The three members of Black Rain, Stephen, David and Adrian, I didn't know them particularly well, and I've got to say that they didn't really stand out.
During the evenings, the students spent time socialising in the airfield bar.
One or two of the witnesses that we did see just simply couldn't remember what happened because they'd drunk so much alcohol and were unable to remember where they were, let alone Stephen.
On Thursday, Stephen went to Scunthorpe to buy his outfit for the fancy dress party at the airfield that night.
Everyone had quite a lot to drink. We were all in fancy dress, dressed up as women, and sing karaoke, sing lots of songs together. Steve seemed to be his normal self at the party. He was in a good mood, loud and lively. The party finished quite late. Everyone made their way off. I think Steve slept in his car and I slept in my car.
Stephen's fatal jump was the next day. He fell to his death at 2:30 p.m. police turned to skydiving and forensic experts for advice on how to gather the evidence.
Humberside Police got in touch with the Forensic Science Service, and the advice given was to go for DNA on the cut ends of the straps. Whoever's cut the straps would have been handling them in some way, and we were hoping that that would have left DNA on the straps, and that by swabbing them we could have picked that DNA up and got a profile.
The scientists' aim was to find a match between DNA found on the cut straps and DNA taken from the skydivers on the day.
Everyone who was at that jump were kept behind, and their DNA swabs were taken from them. Essentially, if we'd got any sort of result from the straps, we could speed up the process of eliminating people, so we'd have all their samples straight away.
So far, the police operation had run smoothly. But a misunderstanding over a pair of scissors was to have serious implications for the investigation.
The scissors that I was given to actually take the samples with, cut the samples, were old, and they were moving, they wouldn't cut it properly. So that's when we decided to use a hook knife.
From this, the police wrongly concluded that the saboteur must also have used a knife.
We were told at the scene on that evening that scissors could not cut the straps. So at that stage, we concentrated our efforts on implements that we thought could cut the straps.
It could have been misinterpreted by the police that I meant that it couldn't be cut by scissors. It couldn't be cut by the pair of scissors I had. Obviously, with a brand new pair of scissors, that webbing could be cut.
But the confusion wasn't spotted at the time. So when they searched Stephen's car, they missed the significance of a crucial piece of evidence.
We found a pair of scissors in his car boot. These were normal domestic scissors, which on the face of it didn't appear to be capable of causing the damage to the straps. Bear in mind that we'd been told that Stephen's rig could not be cut by scissors.
The scissors weren't seen as a priority for forensic examination. Meanwhile, the police were concentrating on making contact with the 5,000 skydivers across the UK. Colin Andrews believed that a murderer might well have spoken to one of them about the crime.
We sent a personal letter to every skydiver in the country. We did a Crime Watch programme where an appeal was made to millions of people. We used the internet site, we used local newspaper. This case was in the media every single day.
The grieving parents of murdered skydiver Stephen Hilder today made an emotional appeal for help in finding his killer.
We're living through every parent's worst nightmare. We're only here today in the hope that somebody can help the police to progress things to a point where we can bring Steve home and grieve for him in private.
We had no desire to share our grief and so on in a public at all. It's a dreadful thing to be doing. But the police were convinced that it's one way of triggering people who know something to come forward and provide information.
But despite all the publicity, there were no new leads. And there was further bad news from the forensics lab. There was no single clear DNA profile on the cut straps.
There's DNA from a number of people there, and once you get that sort of mixture, it's impossible to pick out individuals from it within that mixture. It means that at some point a number of people have handled those straps.
The hope of solving the crime on DNA evidence had drawn a blank. But 3 months after Stephen's death, the police thought they had their breakthrough.
We can reveal that 2 friends of skydiver Stephen Hilder have been arrested in connection with his death.
After a 9-month murder investigation into Stephen Hilder's death, police made a sudden announcement to the media.
The story appears to be heading for a new and dramatic twist. Perhaps it was Stephen himself who sabotaged his own parachutes.
It was clearly very difficult when the emphasis of the investigation switched from murder to possibly suicide, and we weren't surprised that the media picked up on that very strongly.
Those who knew Stephen best didn't believe that this video footage filmed immediately before his death could possibly be someone contemplating suicide.
He was okay. That was Steve. There was absolutely nothing there to suggest that he knew what was about to happen.
To me, Steve seemed perfectly normal before the jump, how he had been on like lots of other jumps before.
I've watched that tape over and over again, and I've looked into his eyes, and even after suggestions of suicide and everything, I can't see anything. That's just Steve. That's just Steve, being normal, like he always was.
We saw nothing that would give a hint of any change in his character. We don't believe it is in his character, so we're of the view that he did not take his own life.
When the inquest opened in March 2005, police were convinced that none of the earlier suspects was guilty of murder, and that Stephen had taken his own life.
I was satisfied and sure at the end of this investigation that nobody else was involved in Stephen's death.
There were a number of factors which lent weight to the theory that Stephen had committed suicide. First, there were his debts.
Steve was always very conscious of the fact that he was no good with money. It was like water in his hands. So although we weren't aware of the level of debt that he'd got himself into, we weren't surprised that he was in debt.
Stephen owed around £17,000.
I was actually really surprised when it was suggested that he may have committed suicide because of his debt, because he didn't seem that worried about it, and he was just like, yeah, no, it's fine, I'll get it sorted.
The coroner, I remember, clearly expressed the view that the level of debt, in fact, was not much greater than the national student average.
He knew that he was going to be in the military. He knew that that was a job for life. He knew that, you know, with that sort of security behind him, wherever he was financially at that time, he would be able to fix it in the long run.
Secondly, Stephen was having difficulties academically. He'd failed some of his first-year exams.
I can't believe that he would kill himself because of his exams, because he knew how well he'd done, and he'd actually been thinking about it and had come up with like a plan for what he wanted to do instead.
Stephen was considering a transfer to the Royal Navy.
He was certainly very positive about his career and the direction it was going in, despite considering perhaps a switch to the Navy, but it's still within the basic, within the armed forces and the sort of life that he wanted to lead and the sort of things he wanted to do.
And third, the coroner heard that Stephen's relationship with his girlfriend was coming to an end. But at the inquest, she refuted suggestions that this might have caused him to have suicidal thoughts.
It wasn't a really serious relationship. It was just a casual thing you have at university. Sort of, we were doing the play together for most of the time, so we see each other like at least twice a week for rehearsals. Never saw him at weekends because he was always skydiving. We didn't really need each other all the time. He wasn't obsessed with me or anything like that. He wasn't needy. He wasn't demanding of my time or anything.
In any situation such as this, you'd expect personal relationships to be looked into to some extent. So, yes, it was a factor, but it was not one that was considered to be so overwhelming as to justify someone taking their own life.
And Stephen's conversion to Catholicism at the age of 17 meant that his religious beliefs weren't compatible with suicide.
He was extraordinarily passionate about the fact that he was a recent convert over to that faith, what it actually meant, what limitations that placed on his life, and why that was a good thing.
Jason and Stephen had discussed the obligations imposed on a believer. In the Catholic faith, suicide is a mortal sin.
We did raise the question of suicide, and it was something that Steve was very passionate about, the fact that, you know, what gives you the right to take a life, even if it is your own life.
He believed, he did believe, and that, I think, would be something that would steer him away from taking his own life.
Motives for suicide were looking far from certain. The coroner called Peter Grant, the forensic expert on the case.
The coroner made it clear that he'd left my evidence to the end, as mine was the only evidence that could be interpreted as pointing towards suicide, and he wanted to hear everything else first. From my point of view, the forensic evidence we have, things like the fibres on the scissors, the DNA on the scissors, the fibres on Stephen's clothing, is entirely consistent with suicide.
But the evidence collected was to come under greater scrutiny at the inquest.
There's more than one interpretation to be put to those factual findings quite often, and that's really what happened when it got to the inquest. It was clear that there were different interpretations that you could put to the same facts.
During the hearing, new information emerged, showing that Stephen wasn't the only person with access to the scissors found in the boot of his car.
I'd known at the time that I was carrying out the examinations that Stephen's car was open, although the boot was locked. What emerged at the inquest was that the keys for the car were actually in the ignition.
So I would accept the proposition that in theory it was possible that a person could have gone into the boot of that car and could have planted some evidence.
The scissors, for example, could have been used by someone else to cut the straps if they were wearing gloves and then replaced back in Stephen's car.
Whoever cut the straps on Stephen's parachute would have created a cloud of fibres that would have settled on the parachute and on their clothing.
The fibre evidence has always been controversial, and I recognise that in us removing the parachute when Stephen's body was found, that certainly would have contaminated some of his clothing with fibres.
As the evidence was collected, fibres would have been spread over Stephen's jumpsuit.
We found a lot of fibres on the outside, as we'd expected, but then on the inside of the jumpsuit and on the clothing underneath, we actually found slightly more fibres, which, to my mind, indicates that Stephen had had quite close contact with the parachute pack after the straps had been cut. And the fibres on his clothing could have got there by him handling the parachutes for some sort of pre-flight check.
At the inquest, it was revealed that Stephen had checked his parachute before he put on his jumpsuit. Having reviewed the forensic evidence, the details of Stephen's life, his state of mind, and the circumstances of his death, the coroner gave his conclusion.
Today, a coroner recorded an open verdict. Is this a mystery that will ever be solved?
It's quite clear what was done to the parachute, but it hasn't answered the question of when it was done or who did it and for what reason.
Do I think he killed himself? No. But he's dead and somebody did it.
It's very difficult to live with not having an answer. And I don't know how I'd feel if we knew what had happened or who was responsible.
It must remain a possibility that somebody knows what happened or more about what happened. It's not absolutely the end of the matter, and obviously we must hope that something does come to light. But it may well remain a mystery forever.